Welcome back to this lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. To this point in the course, we have looked at a couple of different arguments for the existence of God. For instance, we looked at some arguments which claim that it would be impossible for us to have meaningful lives without God, and therefore, because our lives are meaningful, God must exist. We've also looked at a couple versions of the cosmological argument, which in general claims that God must exist for us to have an explanation of the origin of the universe or the origin of being itself. In this video, we're going to begin to look now at one of the most famous and most appealed to arguments against the existence of God, and that is an argument which arises from what is known as the problem of evil. In this video, we're going to begin that discussion, and what I want to do here is really just give you the broad contours or outlines of what the problem of evil is, what motivates it, and what are some different ways that one might respond to the problem of evil. So first, let's talk about a little bit about what the problem is. In this video, I'm really going to be relying on Daniel Speke's book, which is an introduction to the problem of evil. And he describes what he calls the philosophical problem of evil in the following way. It's the problem of how the existence of God can be made consistent with the existence of a world that contains evil. We all accept that very bad things happen, horrible tragedies occur, and yet if we reflect on that point, we might wonder, how is the existence of such evil, such tragedy, such utter despair, how is that consistent with the idea that a God exists? Specifically, a God that is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Why wouldn't a God that is all good, why wouldn't such a God have a will to stop the evil? Why wouldn't a God that is all-knowing and all-powerful have the ability to stop that evil? And so it's natural to see how reflection on the existence of evil can lead to a sort of skepticism or questioning about whether in fact God exists. Now, to further motivate this, I want to focus on a couple examples of evil which might prompt this sort of questioning. And as just a forewarning, so one of the examples I'm about to talk about comes from Speke's book, and it does involve describing the death of a young child, so just to make you aware of that, if that is something that you would be concerned hearing about. But in any case, here's the case. It's a real-life case that Speke describes. He says, a decade or so back, when our son was still quite young, my wife and I were in the habit of getting together regularly, roughly weekly, with a group of our friends at one of our homes. A little food, a little conversation, and the kids with a babysitter, a good evening for everyone typically. The last time that group ever got together, however, was tragically memorable. I showed up at the home of the housed Mary a smidge earlier than everyone else, to find a pair of police cars and Mary out front. Before I could get my car parked, it became clear that Mary was absolutely distraught. The explanation for her state turned out to be that her 4-year-old son had drowned in their backyard pool some short time prior to my arrival. The son, Joshua, had evidently either climbed over the short protective pool fence by way of some bigger toys pressed up against it, or had come through the gate accidentally left open by the pool cleaner. Now, this is, of course, a horrible and just unspeakable tragedy that you wouldn't wish on anyone. If anything is sort of an example of evil, this would clearly fit the bill. Now, as we're going to see, oftentimes when people motivate the problem of evil, they'll point to big tragedies like natural disasters or the Holocaust as sort of paradigmatic examples. But I think one reason to think about this sort of example is that it is not a relatively large-scale or complex phenomena. In fact, you might say to some larger tragedies, well, think about the number of things that God would have to change. Maybe that's too much intervention in our world. But Speke notes that in this case, it seems that some very simple changes on God's part could have in fact prevented the evil from occurring. So Speke explains, a light breeze to close the gate or the shifting of a plastic faux barbecue away from the fence is all it would have taken to prevent this. If it is easier for God to put thoughts into heads than to move things around in the macro world, then a small and unobtrusive reminder for either the pool cleaner or Mary would have easily done the trick. If God simply would have shifted a couple material objects a few inches from where they were, if God would have put a reminder in the heads of the parents to take the necessary precautions to make sure that this could not have happened, then the tragedy would have been prevented. For an all-powerful, all-knowing being, certainly those sorts of things wouldn't be beyond the scope of God's capabilities. And if God is all good, then it seems that God would in fact want to prevent such a tragedy from happening. And so we're left with the question of why. Now, as I said, oftentimes when people want to motivate the philosophical problem of evil, they'll talk about large-scale tragedies like the Holocaust. And in fact, we see this from, for instance, Pope John Paul II, when in 1982 he visited the concentration camp Auschwitz. And this is what he said at the time: in a place like this, words fail. In the end, there can only be a dread silence, a silence which is itself a heartfelt cry to God. Why, Lord, did you remain silent? How could you tolerate all this? And that simply is the question. When we look at the horrible tragedies and evils that happen in the world, we imagine if there is in fact a God that exists and is responsible for the creation and maintenance of the world, then it seems that God has to, in some sense, tolerate this evil. And so the question is, why? And if there is no good answer to the question of why, then we might start to question, do we have a good reason to think that in fact God does not exist? That is in fact the foundation of the philosophical problem of evil. Now, one of the points I think is very important to make, and that I think Speake does a good job of making in his book, is that he separates what he calls two different problems, right? I've been referring to the philosophical problem of evil, but he separates it from the personal problem of evil. So the philosophical problem, as I said before, is just the question of how can the existence of God be reconciled with so much evil in the universe? But he says the personal problem is somewhat different. The personal problem, by contrast, is a matter of how to live with it, it referring to evil, how to survive it and even counteract it in our own lives and in the world more generally. So there's a couple questions here. The philosophical problem just is it'll engage in logical reasoning and rational thought to determine how much evil would a perfect God allow to happen in this world. But the personal problem is different, because imagine you knew someone in your own personal life, a friend or a family member, who had suffered a horrible tragedy. Imagine they were just totally distraught, feeling a deep emotional and abiding sadness, and it was your job to comfort them. Now, as we're going to see, all responses to the philosophical problem of evil, there are different kinds of responses, as we'll see, but all of them share a similar characteristic in that, in some form or fashion, the explanation has to be, it is better off for the world as a whole that this thing happened rather than not happening. Or at least we don't have a reason to know or think that the world is not better off because this happened. But imagine you told that to someone. You said to someone, look, who's suffering from a horrible tragedy, you went up to them and said, you should feel a lot better. You shouldn't be sad about this because the fact that this tragedy happened to you is actually the best thing for the world as a whole. Well, maybe that's true, and that's a matter of philosophical argument, which we'll get into. But it would also be really just a sort of callous response. It would be an inappropriate response to an emotional need. It would be a philosophical response to an emotional or psychological or existential problem. And so the point to make here is that when we're in this discussion, we're not going to be so much focused on how to deal with evil in our personal lives. The way we deal with evil in our personal lives is through a personal connection with the people we love. As Speake puts it, these two, if we fail to distinguish between these two problems, the philosophical and the personal, we might fall into the trap of offering philosophical arguments when we should instead be offering a hug. So the first thing to say is that no response to the philosophical problem of evil is intended to get rid of all the sadness and emotional angst that evil causes. The point simply is to consider the more abstract question: is the presence of evil a sufficient reason for us to say that we can no longer have good reason to believe in God? So now that we have distinguished between the philosophical and personal problems of evil, I want to focus again on the philosophical problem and explain it in a little more detail. One way of understanding the philosophical problem of evil is that it claims that what Speake calls common theism is inconsistent. So what is common theism? It's just a set of propositions or statements that Speake thinks the majority of traditional theists or people who believe in God hold are true. And here are the 5 propositions. 1, God exists. 2, God is omnipotent or all-powerful. 3, God is omniscient or all-knowing. 4, God is omnibenevolent or all-good. And 5, evil exists. Now, this isn't to say that every single person who believes in God believes all these things are true. Some people do not, but it just means the normal sort of traditional theism, regardless of what specific religion we're talking about, as long as a monotheistic one, a traditional monotheistic believer would think that these 5 claims are true. So a way to think about what the philosophical problem of evil says is that it says this set of propositions is inconsistent. Right? The philosophical problem of evil doesn't say that all these things are false. It just says they cannot all be true. That means that at least one of them must be false. And most specifically, it really focuses on the idea that if 5 is true, if evil exists, then we've got to get rid of at least 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, to see why this is, I want to go to a very famous quote from a philosopher, David Hume, that comes from his book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And here, in just a few sentences, he explains why there seems to be a tension between these claims, that God exists, that God has all God's traditional attributes, and that evil exists. So here is the statement. Hume asks, is he willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence is the evil? So what is Hume saying here? He says, well, look, if God is willing to prevent evil, but he can't prevent it, then he can't be omnipotent. He's lacking in power or capability. If he can prevent evil, but he just isn't willing to do so, then you might say, well, if you have the ability to stop some great evil from happening, but you just refuse to, then you can't be all good. You must be someone who's malevolent, who's uncaring about others. And he says, well, finally, if you're telling me that God is both able to prevent evil and he wants to prevent evil, then there shouldn't be any evil. But in fact, as we just said, as we look throughout the world, there are many cases of evil. There are many cases of horrible tragedies that we think a being that is all good, all knowing, and all powerful would be able to prevent. So what Hume here is saying is he's not arguing that any particular one of those propositions must be false. He's just saying they can't all be true. You've got to give up at least one. And that fundamentally is what the philosophical problem of evil says. Maybe you can have a God that exists and is all powerful and all knowing, but not all good. Maybe you can have a God that exists that is all good, but not all powerful and all knowing. But you can't have all the propositions that constitute the set of common theism. That's at least what the philosophical problem of evil charges. So given this characterization of the philosophical problem of evil, we can see the shape the debate's going to take. The question really is an all-perfect God consistent with evil, or is an all-perfect God not consistent with evil? And so we'll be diving into that specific debate. But for the moment, I just want to consider, let's say that it's true that the common theism set is inconsistent. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that it's true that not all of those propositions can be true. And again, I'm not saying it is true. We'll have more time to examine the debate. I'm just saying let's assume for the sake of argument. And the reason I want to do that is because you might say, well, okay, let's say they can't all be true. Is that really such a big problem for the theist? Is it really such a big problem for the believer? Maybe the theist can give up one of those propositions and it's not such a big deal. So let's go through the different options. Let's consider what would be the consequences for the theist to give up any of these propositions. So the first option, let's say you give up one. You give up the claim that God exists. Well, obviously, I won't go into this too much. This would not be an attractive option for the theist because the foundation of theistic belief is that God exists, and so to give that up would just mean you're not a theist anymore. It would certainly mean the person pushing the philosophical problem of evil has scored a significant victory, so that's not such an attractive option. But a more common option, you might say, well, why can't I just believe in God, but that God maybe is lacking some of the traditional attributes? You might say, maybe I believe in a God that's powerful, and even very powerful, but not all powerful. So there's some evil that God can't stop. Or maybe I believe in a God that's very knowledgeable, but doesn't know everything. So there's just some evils God doesn't know about or doesn't know how to stop. Maybe I believe in a God that is very good, but not all good. Maybe God has some weakness of will, some lapses in moral judgment that sometimes allow evils to occur. The question is, traditionally, theists have, in many religious traditions, have seen God as a perfect being. But you might just say, well, why don't I give up either 2, 3, or 4 and just say, God is very good, God is very powerful, God is not perfect. Now, this is an option, and one thing I'll be interested in hearing from you about is whether you think this is an attractive option for the theist. But the thing I'll just point out here is that this is an option that some individuals have taken. So, for instance, the philosopher Peter Bertocci, he argues the following. He says, out of respect for what seem the facts of human experience, it seems necessary to modify our conceptions of God. Right, and he says the most reasonable suggestion is to limit God's power. So he says, look, we have to face up to the fact that evil exists. The existence of evil is not consistent with a perfect God. So he says the most reasonable suggestion, I think, would be to say that God is in fact not all-powerful. Now, to be clear, this is not really a position that is endorsed by any of the traditional monotheistic religions. Pretty much all the traditional monotheistic religions see God as perfect in all ways, all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. But theoretically, it is a possibility. And if you wanted to get around the problem of evil, you could give up one of those traditional characteristics, or you could just weaken it somewhat. So I'll be very interested to hear about what you think about whether that's an attractive option. But there's a third option we should consider as well. You might say, look, I'm going to keep the claim that God exists, I'm going to keep the claim that God is perfect, but I'm going to deny that evil exists. Now, on its face, this seems like just to fly in the face of reality, because as we've talked about, there are so many different examples of evil and tragedy, it's unclear what this could even mean when you say evil doesn't exist. Now, on this point, there isn't one philosopher who he didn't quite say evil doesn't exist, but he did say at least something along these lines. So, for instance, the Catholic philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas had a particular explanation of evil where evil was not something that existed positively, but only something that existed negatively. Right? And so, I won't read through this entire passage, but basically he says, because God is the grounding of all existence and God is the grounding of all being, then everything that exists must be, to some extent, a reflection of God and must be a good thing in itself. So every single thing that exists is good. And so he says, well, then what is evil? Aquinas tells us, consequently it remains that evil, according as it is evil, is not numbered among the things they are, but is a privation of some particular good, inhering in a particular good. So he says what evil isn't something that actually exists. Evil is a lack. Evil is something that is not present. So just take one simple example, which he also uses. Take the example of blindness. You might say blindness is something that's unfortunate, and a certain way of talking, it's a bad thing, it's evil. Right? So, but what is blindness? It's not anything positive. It's just a lack of ability to see. Now, there's a couple questions here that we might pose. First, we would wonder, is it possible to explain all instances of evil like that? Something like the Holocaust or a natural disaster, right? Are those really all privations or lacks? That would take more discussion. But another thing to notice here is that even if we accept this idea that evil is a privation, doesn't necessarily imply that evil doesn't exist. Aquinas himself says at the end of this passage, consequently I say that evil is not something, but that to which evil happens is something, inasmuch as evil deprives of only some particular good. Thus, for instance, blindness itself is not something, but that to which blindness happens is something. So blindness itself is a lack or privation, fine, that's granted, but there are real people in the world who suffer from it, and many other various evil afflictions and maladies and tragedies that occur. So even if you take Aquinas' position and you hold that evil is a lack and privation and not something positively existent, it's not really clear that that means evil doesn't exist. It just means that evil is always a lack instead of something you can sort of bump up into the world. But bad things still happen. These privations and lacks still happen, and they still do cause individuals to suffer. So even on this account, I think we would still probably say that in the relevant sense, evil does exist. So in any case here, we've gone through all the different possibilities for the common theist, and you might be able to take some of those options, but the thing I would say is that for the common theist to give up any of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, those 5 propositions, to give any of those up does come at significant cost. And so I think the thing we would say is that the theist does have strong motivation to want to provide some sort of response to the philosophical problem of evil, some way of explaining how all 5 of those propositions can in fact be true. So if we do think that a response to the problem of evil is needed, then it's worth thinking about what that response might look like. And to finish off this video, I want to take a look at a couple of different kinds of responses that the theist might make to the problem of evil. And to make this point, I want to look at sort of a more concrete example, not having to do with the problem of evil and God, but something just more mundane, more everyday. So Speke gives the following example as sort of an analogy. We'll call this case armed robbery. He says, suppose, for example, you've been accused of a serious crime, armed robbery, say. The prosecuting attorney brings a case against you, the conclusion of which is that you are guilty of having entered a particular store on a certain date and of using a gun to force its owner to give you the money in the cash register. What the prosecutor purports to show, we might say, is that there is a deep tension in the set of propositions describing the actual circumstances at the time of the crime that also include the proposition you did not commit the crime. So what is this analogy? Let's say the person being accused of this crime is named Ryan. Well, what Ryan is going to want to claim, and what Ryan's defense team are going to want to claim, is that all of the following propositions can be true. Right? And we're going to suppose in this case that both sides agree on the pieces of evidence. The evidence itself is not in dispute. So what Ryan wants to show, and what his lawyer wants to show, is that one, it can be true that eyewitness testimony places Ryan at the scene of the crime around the time in which it occurred. Ryan's fingerprints were on the gun used to commit the crime. Ryan was desperate for some quick cash, and Ryan is innocent. So what the defense wants to show is that even though 1, 2, and 3 do seem to be indicting, maybe they suggest that Ryan in fact committed this armed robbery, that despite that fact, Ryan is in fact innocent. But of course the prosecution wants to claim the opposite. The prosecution wants to claim, no, it's impossible for all those to be true. And of course, because both sides agree on 1, 2, and 3, they agree in the evidence, the prosecution says the proposition we need to get rid of is that Ryan is innocent of the crime, and in fact, Ryan should be considered guilty. So we see a similar thing going on here. On the one hand, the prosecution, which you can analogize to those pressing the problem of evil, say, this set is inconsistent, you've got to get rid of one of them. On the other hand, the defense, those who would be analogized to theists who want to respond to the problem of evil, say, no, it's reasonable to believe that all these are true. It's reasonable to believe all this evidence and that Ryan is innocent. It's reasonable to believe that evil exists and a perfect God can still exist. And so the main point I want to make here is to think about sort of what these strategies would be. Right, so if you were defending Ryan here, just like in the context of the problem of evil, if you were defending the existence of a perfect God, if you were defending Ryan here, what would be your goal? What would be your aim? What strategy might you take? Now first, just consider what you would say in the courtroom itself. Right, as a legal matter, if you are Ryan's attorney, your main goal is just to get Ryan declared get Ryan declared not guilty. And what does that mean? In a court of law, it just means you have to convince the jury that there is reasonable doubt about whether Ryan is guilty. So you might say something like this, right? Look, even if all the evidence presented is true, there's not enough to hold me legally responsible for the crime. After all, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. I had my gun stolen the week prior, and many other people are desperate for cash. So you must find me not guilty. Now notice what this sort of response does and what it doesn't do. What it does, it just tries to find holes in the case of the prosecution and say, look, there's not only doubt, there's reasonable doubt here. A reasonable person could look at this and say, yeah, Ryan could be the person who did it, but these other people could have as well. There's really not enough to say that Ryan is definitely guilty. There's still reasonable doubt here. But notice what the legal response doesn't do. It doesn't actually identify who committed the crime. It doesn't explain why Ryan could not have done it. It just says there's not enough evidence to know that Ryan did do it. And let's say the lawyer is successful. The lawyer defends Ryan, and Ryan returns home back to his community and wants to begin in his job again and reintegrate into social life. What problem is Ryan going to have? Well, maybe this trial was in the news, maybe people were following it, and even if he was declared not guilty, many people might be suspicious. They might say, well, yeah, I know you got off in court, but we still sort of think you did it. And until you can explain who actually did do it, or provide some evidence which exonerates you or show how you didn't do it, then in the so-called court of public opinion, they might find Ryan guilty. And that's why often, in addition to a legal response, a defendant might be concerned about a social response. Right? A response that actually shows how unlikely it is that Ryan actually committed the crime. And Speak explains, what would it take to do this? You would have to show to everyone who matters to you not only that the appearance of your guilt was only an appearance, but also how you are innocent. Why it is quite reasonable to believe your innocence despite the appearances. To say this is who did it, this is why I couldn't have done it. To come up with some harder evidence that actually exonerates you and makes the other members of your community, your friends, your family, your coworkers comfortable with feeling that you're not a criminal. Now, why do I bring this up? Because in the philosophical debate about the problem of evil, you see two similar approaches. And these approaches are called a defense and a theodicy. A defense is like the legal response. It's the weaker response. When you provide a defense, you're not saying, I know why God allows evil, or this is why that evil had to occur, this is how it forms a part of the grander overall plan. When you provide a defense, what you're essentially saying is, I'm not in a position to know or expect to know why God permits evil. And because I'm not in a position to know that, there's still reasonable doubt about whether evil actually shows that a perfect being cannot exist. So, providing a defense of God in the context of the problem of evil is just like providing Ryan a legal defense. You're pointing to instances of reasonable doubt to say that we can know that evil shows God does not exist. But then that still leaves open a lot of questions. You might say, okay, yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe I'm not in a position to know that God can't exist. Right? Maybe I shouldn't expect to see all the reasons God would provide would have for permitting evil. But I've still got a lot of questions, right? To be really comfortable, maybe I would actually want to know in a more particular way, why does God allow bad things to happen? And this would be the stronger response. This would be like the social response. And in philosophy, this is called a theodicy. A theodicy goes beyond a defense, where in a theodicy, you're not just saying, well, there's reasonable doubt about whether evil shows God doesn't exist. In the context of a theodicy, you're saying, here is a plausible reason God could have for allowing evil. If all evil is supposed to serve some higher good, here are the higher and greater goods that God achieves by allowing evil to happen. It's a stronger response. It's also a more difficult response to make. And as we'll see, those writing about the problem of evil have made both kinds of responses at various points. And we'll look at each of these in the videos that follow. So I will stop there. We'll look more into the problem of evil and defense and theodicy in subsequent videos. As always, I thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.